We're seeing it in the Sahel, where the advance of the desert and its increase in size is increasing the suffering as a result of the conflicts in Sahel. We're also seeing it in Somalia, where again it's reinforced the drivers of the civil conflict. And we also saw it actually in the war in Syria, when a major drought in about 2008 helped create the conditions for the uprising by driving a load of small farmers out of business and then leaving the farms in conditions of destitution to go into the cities. And the areas where they settled were areas that rose up against the government very early. So here at IISS, we have absolutely no doubt that this is acting as a driver and an accelerator of conflict. It reduces human security by making areas less wealthy, people who live on the margins of agriculture, and making them more desperate. So they become more likely to take up arms. And we've certainly seen evidence of that applying in Somalia. And that's conflict within states. Now, it can also act as a friction between states. I mean, if you want to take an example, nuclear-armed India and Pakistan, two countries that are at a considerable state of military tension routinely, there is an agreement about sharing the water of the River Indus. If the amount of water going down the River Indus decreases, that will act as a driver of strategic tension between India and Pakistan. The chances of the UK going to war with another country in Europe over climate are thankfully very, very low, in part because of the way NATO acts as a binding force. But it's my view that climate change will see an increase in refugee flows towards Europe. And the handling of refugees is an issue that has caused international tension within Europe. And it's also an issue that's become militarized, because the militaries have been used a lot to help border forces and border authorities. All these implications of climate change, particularly in terms of extreme weather events, could well trigger calls for extra military support to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and not just in places like Somalia or the Sahel or the Indian subcontinent, but in Europe and indeed in the UK. And we should have no illusions that some aspects of climate change are a direct threat to the operational effectiveness of the armed forces. The rising heat in the Gulf, the threat to low-lying barracks and naval bases, for example, the greatly increased number of wildfires there are on army ranges and training areas. So armed forces are going to have to adapt and future-proof themselves. I think the risk is quite considerable, and I wouldn't underestimate the risk of what climate scientists call tipping points. That is, you could get something that flips a switch, makes something much worse, and then sets off a positive feedback, which then just amplifies the effect. What is really quite striking is all the nations that are members of the Climate Change Convention, the national government's representatives, have been through the draft of that IPCC report, and they haven't thrown it out. So for once, we have a real global consensus across all the governments in the world. So this has a lot of implications for the military, but I do think that the UK Ministry of Defence and the armed forces, particularly the Army and the Air Force, are in the global lead on this.